Thank you for tuning in to an episode of InRange. Hopefully this one's going to bring you a lot of interesting information, essentially the history and origins of the iconic American lever-action rifle. And I'm going to walk through the development of this rifle from the early or late 1840s, early 1850s up until 1873. The lever-action rifle continued to be an American icon past 1873, but in this video we're going to specifically focus on the ones that today we would call pistol caliber. Guys, hopefully you like and enjoy this kind of content. It is completely Patreon supporters that have made this viable. These guns were purchased with Patreon funds, and you will see them and have seen them in matches on the video on the channel, and we'll see more of it in the future. If you do like this kind of content and are not a Patreon supporter, please consider it. It is only Patreon that keeps InRange alive. We have no support, no monetization, and no sponsorship from anywhere but the viewer like you. That said, let's go ahead and start with the beginnings of this, which in the late 1840s, early 1850s, a man by the name of Hunt came up with the idea of forming something later called the rocket ball. At the time, there really wasn't self-contained ammunition like we see here, but what we did have are projectiles much like this. This is an actual Civil War .58 caliber Minié ball for a muzzleloader. It's intentionally undersized dimensionally to the bore diameter so that it can be seated with a ramrod in a foul bore, but when this seats against the powder charge and it's ignited by a percussion cap, the expanding gases of the black powder cause the tail of this hollow-based projectile to expand and engage the rifling as it goes down the barrel, thus stabilizing it in flight. But Mr. Hunt looked at this and decided to do something different. He packed this hollow base with the powder charge and an ignition system and made this, really, in the late 1840s, early 1850s, the very first form of caseless ammunition. How funny is that? But anyways, that ultimately became called the rocket ball round. And two men really caught the attention of two different investors at that time, a man by the name of Smith and another man by the name of Wesson. And they worked with Mr. Hunt to develop the very first really self-contained cartridge repeating action, which was then later named the Volcanic. It is a toggle link system, identical in function to what you see with what became the Winchester, and nothing more changed than that. So they started that, the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company, or the Volcanic Arms Company, and the problem with that company is that the ammunition was very anemic. That rocket ball ammunition, even with improvements, was very low velocity and had very bad terminal ballistics. And as a result, it really didn't have a place in the market. There was another person, however, that saw this company and had another idea about where to go with it. His name was Winchester, and he started investing in them as well. Due to the fact that the gun couldn't be sold because of those terminal ballistics very well on the market, the company went insolvent and went bankrupt. But Winchester continued the idea and formed the New Haven Arms Company, and brought over what was then the shop superintendent for the original Volcanic Company, a guy by the name of Henry. Henry started working for the New Haven Arms Company and did nothing more to the Volcanic repeating rifle, but decided to do something different with the ammunition. They abandoned the rocket ball ammunition and developed something new, the 44 Henry rimfire, which was a self-contained cartridge that allowed the projectile to be seated in, of course, in a case, rimfired, primered, and it had 28 grains of black powder behind it, significantly more than what was in the original rocket ball ammunition. This changed the game dramatically. By taking the original Volcanic design, the toggling system, which was proven to be a good, reliable repeater, and turning it into a self-contained cartridge case, that meant you had a 200 grain bullet on top of 28 grains of black powder, sometimes a 210 grain bullet, and what that did is allowed you to put that 210 grain projectile out of the 1860 now Henry rifle at approximately 1,200 feet per second. This actually had terminal ballistics. It had capability. This made the 1860 Henry a viable weapon, not only for military applications, but for civilian ones as well. And the Henry became the first iconic American lever-action rifle that, of course, the Confederates referred to as the Union rifle that you load on Sunday and shoot all week. At a capacity of 15 plus 1 of that 44 Henry rimfire, that certainly would seem to be the case when you yourself were armed with a single-shot muzzleloader. However, at that point, Winchester changed the name to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and Mr. Henry, who was the shop superintendent and ultimately the progenitor of the ammunition that made the 1860 Henry viable, felt that the gun could not be improved, but others felt differently. Another man by the name of King developed a loading system right here that you see in the next development of the 1860 Henry, becoming the 1866 Winchester. Same exact cartridge, 44 Henry rimfire, but instead of loading it from the top, you load it through the actual side port of the receiver. This allowed you to do a lot of tactically sound things. First of all, you could just easily stuff rounds in here and top it off. Even if you fired 4 rounds, you could just easily top it off, something you could not do with the 1860. So when you're on the move, a couple more rounds in this, in theory, this gun would never run dry if you could keep feeding ammunition to the rear. You could stay prone, turn it on its side, feed ammunition in it, and that was a huge tactical advantage and mechanical advantage, and a huge improvement of the 1860 Henry design that ultimately culminated in the 1866 Winchester, and once again, still chambered in that 44 Henry rimfire. This was a wildly successful rifle that continued to be produced for a very long time and continued to be purchased even after later developments happened in the lever action world. And the 44 Henry rimfire cartridge continued to be produced up until, I believe, the 1930s, which goes to show you how long and how much longevity that particular round had, very much like we would think of 5.56 today. So that was a huge improvement. We're going to go through these a little more shortly in closer detail. But that happened in 1866, and nothing really changed for a while. That gun was, for all tactical purposes, sound. Nothing really needed to change, and it was nothing more than a very relatively simple modification to what was the original 1860 Henry. The toggle link action in both of those guns is identical. The lifter action, the way it functions, nothing whatsoever is different. However, another big thing happened in 1873. Now, this is where you see a huge improvement and leap forward in terms of the actual Winchester repeating lever action rifle. Another improvement, much like the 44 Henry was a huge improvement to the 1860 Henry from the Volcanic, was that this, in 1873, was released in a new cartridge called the 4440, which is right here. This was a big step up in terms of terminal ballistics. So if the 44 Henry rimfire was a 210 grain bullet moving at approximately 1200 feet per second out of a rifle, the 44 Henry was a 200 grain bullet leaving a 24-inch barrel, the same barrel length, at 1800 feet per second, making it far more ballistically capable, giving a flatter, easier shooting trajectory, making hits easier, all the things that come with the flatter shooting cartridges, and of course more power meant that it was more ballistically capable against whatever you shot with it, whether it was wild game or an enemy assailant. There were other big improvements to the 1873, which we're going to go over more closely with some updated detail there. But first, let's go through the cartridge development of what made all of this happen. As we've seen, the actual toggle link system didn't change really basically past the 1850s with the Volcanic. The same toggle link system in the 1873 is mechanically no different than that what was in the Volcanic, at least not very discernibly so. So here we have the 1860 Henry. Now this is a reproduction by Uberti. Originals are worth a lot of money and really not usable because 44 Henry rimfire is no longer produced. However, it is still an iconic lever action, and it feeds through this magazine tube right here. You move this all the way up, turn it, put the cartridges down from the front, down this magazine tube, let the follower drop on them cautiously and carefully, cycle the action, and every time you run the action, it ejects the spent cartridge case out the top, and then feeds a new one, which allows you to fire all 15 plus 1 rounds as fast as you can run the lever, chamber the round. Mr. Henry pretty much thought that this was the best possible configuration and that there was no room for improvement on it, but he was ultimately wrong. Functionally, you can see these are the same thing. There's really nothing different going on here. The big difference is the magazine tube is no longer open, which is a good guard against dirt and debris. You don't feed it from the front anymore like you do with the Henry. You feed it through this Kingsgate patent, which you just shove the rounds in here. But functionally, same exact thing. Every time you cycle this lever, round pops onto the lifter gets indexed with the chamber, the bolt puts the round into the chamber, the hammer fires it. Cycle, cycle, cycle until all the rounds are depleted out of the magazine. This Kingsgate patent and loading system alone fundamentally made what was originally the 1860 Henry into a far more field viable weapon with a better, not only the ability to be more impervious to dirt and debris in the field, but also a more tactically sound design, and that you could feed it consistently, top it off, use it in combat without having to expose yourself or go out of a prone position. However, in 1873, technology changed a lot, or I should say development of the lever action changed a lot. And here we have the 1873 Winchester lever action rifle. Besides being chambered in a much more potent round, a lot of design changes happened with the 1873 very specifically. One, you can see that there's a side plate here that's removable in a different way. You don't have to take out the actual lever screw to take off the side plates or clean the gun. There's one screw on the opposite side of the receiver right here. Once you pull that screw out, this plate comes off and this plate can come off, allowing you to do a lot of field maintenance without having to take the entire gun apart or remove the lever screw itself. Additionally, another couple things came about on this as well. There is now a safety on this system. You'll see right here, this little plunger has to be depressed by the lever, allowing the trigger to be pulled. This means that when this lever can only be closed all the way when the gun is fully in battery, and the only way that that lever is depressed is when the lever is fully in battery. So when this is completely down, that actually deactivates the trigger safety, as you can see. Plunger goes down, as does the trigger safety, which means that you will not be able to fire the 1873 out of battery. It is possible, since there's no safety on the 1866 or 1860, that if you're running the gun fast enough, you can fire this out of battery. Typically, it's not a catastrophic failure to the shooter, but it will bend parts and break the gun. And the ability to cycle the action and pull the trigger and hit your target as fast as you could do that was something that was a huge force multiplier for anyone that had one of these in the field. And they continue to be to this day. Of course, a lot of things have changed, but the lever action rifle is still an amazing weapon.